Let's bring you more on this headline story now. Transport Minister Fikile Mbalula has taken a zero-tolerance approach to drinking and driving. He says South Africa needs a holistic approach to the regulation of alcohol. Now, according to Mbalula, an amendment bill is before Parliament that calls for a 0% alcohol limit for drivers, and the DA has also weighed in on this issue. To unpack the opposition's take on the story, we're joined now by DA MP on Trade and Industry, Dean MacPherson. Dean, good morning. Thanks very much for your time this morning. I mean, this is an issue that has been on the agenda long before COVID-19. Of course, all of these issues are now so stark when we are faced with all of the COVID challenges as a country as well. What is the DA's take on how much government has done up to now as it pertains to alcohol regulation?
Thanks, and thanks for having me this morning. I think there's no doubt that alcohol is a destructive force in any community across the country. But we also need to understand that there is an industry behind it, an industry that generates billions of rands for the economy and creates hundreds of thousands of jobs. And it's really, any decision that's taken always has to be weighed up against those two forces. Now, for the last 4 years, and even longer, the government has been talking tough on alcohol, but has been doing very little about it. In 2016, the government released the draft liquor amendment bill, which is really the foundation for liquor legislation in terms of selling, manufacturing and regulation around it. And that bill has just sat on two successive ministers' desks gathering dust. So, it is interesting now that the government has found a voice on the issue, that Minister Mbalula is now the strongest voice of that. But he sat in that very cabinet that has sat on its hands while alcohol has continued to be destructive in many communities.
Dean, when we look at the issue of alcohol in South Africa, and we know that our community's struggles with alcohol date back many decades before democracy. If we just think about the DOP system as an example, if you go to any impoverished community in the country, you might not find a grocery store, but you'll certainly find a tavern with a liquor license on most likely every single corner. There was a time when government was clamping down on particularly taverns that were close to schools and the operating hours of those taverns. What happened to that initiative, that kind of clamping down?
That's a great question, Michelle, because that is also dealt with in the amendment bill that has gone sideways for the last 4 years. So, the DA itself is very committed to advancing progressive liquor legislation. We developed a white paper ourselves in consultation with our government in the City of Cape Town and the Western Cape Provincial Government, because they've done some excellent work on combating alcohol abuses, but also dealing with the very real costs that any government has to pick up with the destruction of alcohol in communities. So I think that that this the alcohol ban and the successive ban and what has played out since then has obviously been disturbing and makes for disturbing images. And maybe that will be the catalyst for government to finally actually get going on legislation that can better protect our communities, can make regulation tighter around access to alcohol, and can actually, give the industry itself the certainty that it needs to put in measures that can better protect our communities.
Dean, you talked to us earlier about the National Proposed Liquor Act. I think that was the bill that you were talking to us that's apparently just been gathering dust at Parliament for the past few years. There was also the Provincial Liquor Amendment Regulations, and particularly in the Western Cape where the DA governs, how is that province dealing with regulating alcohol, if you take into consideration the unique challenges of alcohol of Western Cape communities in particular?
The Western Cape has been very progressive in the way that it deals with liquor legislation and licensing, and is very sensitive to communities that have religious and cultural needs, and so they have done a lot of work around ensuring that licenses are not granted that may offend certain communities and may not put people at risk where they may have over access to alcohol. The Western Cape government also spends 20 billion rand a year on cleaning up the mess of alcohol, which is completely unfunded and does not come from national government at all. It has to be reprioritized from other budgets. The Western Cape has been very well aware of the destructive force of alcohol. It itself, under the premiership of Helen Ziller, launched an alcohol game changer, which sought to reduce access to alcohol and alcohol dependency in many vulnerable communities, and that was a big success and continues to be a big success under Premier Wendy.
How do you gauge the success of that, though, Dean, in communities? Because when you look around at communities, particularly in areas on the Cape Flats, it does still appear that this is a massive, massive challenge. So how does the DA then gauge that kind of success that you're talking about?
Well, that success comes from the Western Cape's reports that they produce and the results of the game changers. So those are in the public domain, and any person is free to look at those. But we also need to be realistic, Michelle, that the best way to protect communities is to make sure that there is legislation and regulation in place. The moment that we start taking away things like alcohol, like we did under the ban, we see the proliferation of bootlegging and an illegal trade, which then becomes more harmful to consumers and to vulnerable communities. Which is why it's been so frustrating that for the last 4 and more years, where we've had an opportunity from a national perspective to tighten the laws, particularly on access to alcohol, and one of the great suggestions that we had made in conjunction with the Western Cape government was identification on sale, which means that every single person that was going to buy alcohol would have to produce an identity, a form of identity. We also put in some creative suggestions on liquor licenses, that if you violated your conditions a certain number of times, that you would lose your license for up to 5 years. So there was always going to be a great incentive on people who trade in alcohol legally to do so responsibly in order to keep their licenses. And those are the creative solutions that we have to come up with if we're going to solve the problem of alcohol abuse, whether that be in any province. And all 9 provinces in the country suffer the effects of alcohol and the destruction of alcohol, particularly in poorer communities, which is why we need to get on with the job in Parliament, fix our legislation, and not just talk tough, but actually act tough.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks very much for your time this morning on the AM Report. That's Dean MacPherson from the DA. Very interesting, taking a look at some of the statistics related to the burden of alcohol on our economy as South Africa. And these numbers are in fact a couple of years old, but it still paints quite a picture. The indirect cost of the alcohol burden to taxpayers, some 240 billion rand. It's estimated that alcohol is responsible for around 130 deaths every day. Incredibly worrying that. Dean MacPherson, thanks very much.